Hey there! This video is going to talk about the cell cycle, which is the series of events in which a cell will grow, replicate its DNA, and divide to make two daughter cells. So cycle is just a word that means going in a continuous movement, and so that's what happens with cells. They will start at one part of the cycle and continue on, and after they divide, they will be back at the beginning again. We're going to watch a short video clip of some cells dividing. Here they are. So these are human skin cells. They look pretty cool when they divide, don't they? I like how they go all shiny right before they split. So these are human cells growing in a petri dish in a lab, and they're going to keep growing until they fill up the dish, and then once they hit the edges and they've made a complete sheet of skin, they're going to stop dividing. Alright, so let's go back to the slide. There we are. So why do cells divide? So first of all, when you're a baby, you need to be able to grow into an adult, right? So in order to grow, you need to make more cells. And that's because cells don't work so well if they get too big. So you wouldn't want to just grow by making really big cells. It's not going to work out well. And one of the reasons why has to do with the DNA in your cell, because as a cell grows, it gets bigger and it makes more molecules, but it doesn't make more DNA. The DNA doesn't grow. So you only have one set of DNA, right? And you're not going to make more copies of that DNA as your cell gets bigger. It just would mess everything up. So the larger a cell becomes, the more demands the cell places on its DNA, because the DNA is the instructions for building your proteins and all your other molecules in the cell. And so as the cell gets bigger, it needs more and more of those molecules, but you've only got one set of instructions. So imagine if DNA is like a library and the cell is the city. And everybody needs to get books from the library, but as more and more people move into the city and the city gets bigger, it's going to be hard to check out the books that you want if there's only one set of books. People are going to have to start waiting longer and longer and longer for the books they want. Imagine if our Seward Library was the only library in a city as big as Anchorage. That wouldn't work too well. So the cells need to divide so that they have the right cell size for the nice set of DNA instructions that they have. So remember that DNA, or your genes, are the instructions for building molecules, like your proteins. And those proteins go on to do all the work in the cell that make your traits. So for instance, here's a trait, whether you have free earlobes or attached earlobes. That's all thanks to different proteins in the cell. Those proteins have to get made by instructions from the DNA. So the DNA is super important. The other reason why cells need to divide instead of just getting super huge is that cells have to be able to move things in and out. And as a cell grows and gets bigger, it needs to move more and more things in and out of the cell membrane. And also needs to be able to move things, say, from one side of the cell to the other, or maybe to get instructions from the nucleus over to this side of the cell. So the bigger the cell is, the harder it is to move things around. But for instance, if you took this size of cell and split it into 4 cells, now all of a sudden it's much easier to move things in and out or to move things around the cell. So that's 2 reasons why cells have to divide instead of just getting huge. 1 is demands on the DNA, and 2 is the ability to move things around. So one question for you here. What would happen if a cell just randomly split into two cells without doing any sort of advanced preparation? Well, you might get two cells, but are they going to be equal? I mean, what's going to happen with the DNA? Is one cell going to get half the DNA and the other cell gets the other half? Or maybe one cell could get all the DNA and the other wouldn't have any, and maybe they don't have all the organisms they need? That would just be a mess, wouldn't it? So cells have to do a lot of preparations in advance to make sure they're ready to divide. What do you think some of those things are? What needs to happen in the cell before it divides to make sure each new daughter cell has what it needs? Think about it for a second. So one thing that needs to happen is the DNA is actually going to make a copy of itself. And that way, when the cell divides, each of the new cells gets a complete copy of the DNA. But other things that happen are that the cell has to grow to the right size, and also all the right proteins and organelles need to be made and be in the right spots for cell division. And all of these things are really carefully controlled so that everything happens in the right order and everything goes as planned. How does a cell control its cell cycle so that it prepares and divides at the right time? Well, there are proteins called cyclins. So here's the word cyclins. These are called regulatory proteins. They regulate what happens, and they make sure a cell doesn't divide before it's ready. So throughout the cell cycle, there are checkpoints. There are stops along the way where these cyclins check, and they make sure everything is in perfect shape before they move on to the next stage of growth or division. So for instance, it's kind of like a traffic cop. So the cyclin's gonna stop and say, wait, is our DNA okay? Did it duplicate correctly? Do we have what we need to continue on in cell division? Are we healthy? Is everything okay in our environment? There's lots of different signals that come into a cell to tell it whether it needs to divide or not divide. And everything's got to be working smoothly, or these cyclins will stop and say, wait, hang on, we got to fix something. And this is super important so that you don't have damaged cells dividing and making more damaged cells. All right, so brief overview of the cell cycle. At this point, I'd grab out your cell cycle coloring worksheet. Make sure you have that in front of you. And you're going to need some colored pencils. Let's see, you'll need blue, yellow, red, orange, and green right now. So the first stage in the cell cycle is called G1, which stands for gap 1. And this is the phase where cells are growing, and this is where they spend most of their time. So this is just a normal phase for cells where they grow, they make new proteins, new organelles, all the molecules they need. And once they get to a big enough size, there's going to be a checkpoint. And then if the cell decides that it needs to divide, it's gotten the signal, hey, we need more cells. It's going to move into S phase. So in your cell cycle coloring worksheet, where it has the circle that's kind of split up like a pie, the pie spot on the top right is going to be your G1 phase. So in that spot, write G1 and write cell grows. And then in the next pie spot, which is the bottommost pie spot, that's where your cell moves into S phase. So in that spot, write S phase. And then also write DNA replicates. Replication, or another word for it is synthesis. Those are just fancy words that means that the DNA is going to make a copy of itself. So in S for synthesis phase, DNA replicates or makes a second copy of itself. And so it's good to know at this point that DNA comes in long molecules called chromosomes. So your body has like 46 chromosomes, but each type of organism has its own number. Each chromosome is copied during S phase. And then once everything's copied correctly, you're going to move on to the G2 phase, stands for GAP2. So that's the third pie spot on your cell cycle coloring worksheet, kind of the lower left. And that's where the cell prepares for cell division. So it's kind of another growth phase. So you could also write grow and prepare to divide in that spot. So once the DNA is replicated, more organelles and molecules that are going to be needed specifically for cell division, this is where they're made. And then at the end of this phase, the cell is now ready to begin cell division. So hopefully at this point you have G1, S, and G2 on your cell cycle coloring worksheet. And you've written down what happens in each of those phases. So now you're going to color G1 phase blue, S phase is yellow, G2 phase is red. Don't worry about the stages of mitosis just yet. We're going to move on to that in the next video. So that part of this pie is not going to be colored yet. Now the arrows on the outside of your pie, 3 of those will be green because they represent interphase. And all of these, the G1 phase, the S phase, and the G2 phase, are just subsections of interphase. Interphase is going on during all of these, and that just means the regular phase that a cell goes through where it is not actively dividing. So interphase is where a cell spends most of its life, like 90% of its life at least, is interphase. So on those arrows on the outside of the circle, not the topmost one, but the other 3, the 3 by G1 and S and G2, those arrows are going to be green, and you're going to write the word interphase in those 3 arrows. When you're finished with that, then go ahead and move on to the next video, and we will talk about the process of cell division called mitosis.